Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Welcome to Coast AM, the very best in late night talk radio. I'm Richard Serrett, and tonight, this morning, I'm coming to you live from Old Thornhill Village, just north of Toronto. Yesterday, of course, marked the 20th anniversary of what many have referred to as our generation's Pearl Harbor. Now, I know I'm a day late, but I could not talk about 9/11 tonight. Like many of you, I remember exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing when the cascading chain of horrifying events began around 9 a.m. Eastern on September 11, 2001. And within 3 hours, New York's tallest buildings were reduced to rubble, and the Pentagon, the nerve center of the American armed forces, was burning and partially collapsed. Nearly 3,000 civilians lost their lives, and more than 6,000 people were seriously injured, and the entire continent was in collective shock, still trying to make sense of how a supposed coordinated act of terrorism of that magnitude was allowed to take place on American soil. In the 20 years since 9/11, the events that occurred that morning have been analyzed in depth from 1,000 different perspectives. Tonight, this morning, we're going to examine the events from 3. In the first hour, Dr. Judy Wood, a former professor of mechanical engineering and the author of Where Did the Towers Go?, explains why she's concluded that the physical evidence indicates the Twin Towers on 9/11 fell due to directed free energy technology. How else, Dr. Wood argues, could over 1 million tons of building material be turned into dust? In hour 2, investigative researcher S.K. Bain explains not the how, but the who and the why. In his book, The Most Dangerous Book in the World, I'm not editorializing, that's the title, The Most Dangerous Book in the World, 9/11 as Mass Ritual, Bain argues forcefully that the framework for the entire event was a psychological warfare campaign built upon a deadly foundation of black magic and high technology. His book details a view of the sinister nature of the defining event of the 21st century and opens a window into the vast scope of the machinery of oppression that the author asserts has been constructed around us. In hours 3 and 4, David Chandler has a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a Master's in Mathematics. He offers a scientific understanding of the seemingly inexplicable collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, a crash course, if you will, in the implications of freefall. Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather round the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. I'm Richard Serrett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Why don't you stay a while? Dr. Judy Wood is a former professor of mechanical engineering with research interests in experimental stress analysis, structural mechanics, optical methods, deformation analysis, and the materials characterization of biomaterials and composite materials. She's a member of the Society for Experimental Mechanics, co-founded SEM's Biological Systems and Materials Division, and has served on the SEM Composite Materials Technical Division. Dr. Wood started to question the events of 9/11 on that same day when she saw and heard on television was contradictory and appeared to violate the laws of physics. Since that day, she's used her knowledge of engineering mechanics to prove that the collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers could not have happened as the American public was told, and she is the author of Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. Dr. Wood, welcome back. It's been a while. How are you?
Hi, thanks. I'd like to make one correction from what you said earlier, what I'm going to talk about. Let me read the last paragraph of the preface of my book. It says, so let us consider the body of empirical evidence that must be explained in order to determine what happened. What is presented here is not a theory, it is not speculation. It is evidence. Here, then, is the evidence of what happened on 9/11.
All right, fair enough. Did I call it a theory?
Oh, no, you said it was how. You have to first determine what happened before you can say how it happened, who did it, why it was done, and so forth. And
Right.
it's
Well,
so
but by the
important.
how, I guess I was referring to the mechanics and exactly, yeah, what happened
Yeah, yeah,
and
but it is so important to stress that you can't solve a problem until you know what problem you're solving. So you have to first define what happened. And why that's so important is if you're going to run a cover-up, you get people to argue about the how. And in order to argue about the how, they have to skip over the what. So they assume the what. So they're solving an imagined problem. So that's
fair
why it's
enough.
so important.
All right,
That,
so
that
let's
it,
talk about the what. But first, let's talk about what you say didn't happen or what you prove didn't happen. You say the WTC buildings were not destroyed by heat generated from burning jet fuel. They were not destroyed by mini nuclear weaponry. We've heard all of these theories. They were not destroyed by conventional explosives. They were not destroyed by welding materials such as thermite, thermate, or nanothermite.
right.
You say they were dustified. What is dustification? What does that mean?
Well, it's what happened. And when I'm looking at something, a phenomenon, if I don't know what it is, I don't label it with something with a known definition. Like for example, fumes. You don't call it smoke because that already implies it's caused by fire. So you're assuming fire is the cause. So it's important to not let those subconscious assumptions go into place. So I call it dustification. You know, it wasn't a word until then, but there's no question what it means. That the building was turning to dust. Some mechanism caused it to turn to dust. So dustification.
Right. And I've seen videos, and you've pointed these out to me, where you will see, for example, a steel girder coming down, falling down. And as it's coming down in slow motion, you can see almost as if it's a tablet of Alka-Seltzer dissolving in a glass of water.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what first caught your eye when you were watching this on TV?
Yes, it was. I've never seen anything like that before. It was like all of the atoms, instead of being attracted to each other, suddenly repel each other, and it sort of looked like a steam explosion, but out of solid material. And that was weird. But then also, as something's falling, just frothing up into dust, and you look at where it was supposed to land on the ground, and there's just unburned paper and dust.
Right, right. One of the things I thought was unusual is I'm trying to imagine in a 110-story building, how many toilets would be in that building,
Mm.
or filing cabinets, or I don't know, telephones. And when I saw all of those images of what was left, I didn't see toilets. I mean, I don't
No
know if you
toilet.
can.
There's only one file cabinet, and that was from Ben and Jerry's ice cream, and it was underground. And
Right,
they had cash in the file cabinet, and it didn't burn, and so they were able to call up Ben and Jerry and say, "Hey, come get your cash."
right, right. So one has to, wonder how did all of those toilets, all of those filing cabinets simply just disappear? You don't see any of them in the rubble. We're talking about over 1 million tons of building material here, right?
Yes, each tower is a little over a quarter mile tall, with 500,000 tons each.
So let's talk about some of the other. I want to talk about some of the other effects that you talked about. But
Well,
before
I
we do
had
that,
some photos prepared, but at the last minute, I guess they weren't going to get posted. Um,
I believe they
but,
posted a link. They posted a link to the site where
right,
those
but
photos
it's
are.
the specific pictures I was going to talk about. You know, there's a list of them, and if I'd known earlier, I could have made a page with them on it. But anyway, um,
I
that
just wanted to ask you about the dust for one more question regarding the dust specifically.
okay.
Judy, if you were able to gather up some of the dust at the just after 9/11, would there be markers in there? Would there be something that would jump out at you if you were to analyze the dust to say, aha? This is a marker.
Well,
This
there's some of it that was, and it was some of the dust was less than 1/100th of the size of red blood cells.
less than 1/100th the size of blood. And why is that unusual?
It's so small. It's getting down to the atomic size. It's not chunks. Like if a building falls down, or if it's blown apart with controlled demolition, or something like that, you get chunks. You don't get nano-sized dust.
All right. So some of the other effects that you noticed.
Well, if it comes down in dust, it doesn't make a thud when it hits. The equivalent seismic signal was significantly less than it should have been. These buildings, these two towers, had more than 30 times the potential energy of the Seattle Kingdom. But when that was taken down with controlled demolition, it was the same. It was 2.3, and the North Tower made it 2.3, and the South Tower made it 2.1. Less than the Seattle Kingdom, and it's like 30 times the potential energy. And Building 7 was 6 times the potential energy, but it made a 0.6 equivalent on the Richter scale, which is like a jackhammer. So,
right.
It didn't slam to the ground. Also, the ground shook for less than 8 seconds. The ground shook for less time than it would take to drop a bowling ball off the roof of a tower and have it hit the ground. That's a problem.
Oh, okay. Talk to me about what is called the protective bathtub.
But the point that the ground didn't shake long enough to have the building fall down.
Oh, I see. Okay, got it. All right. But there's a
right.
In order
So the building went away faster than it would take it to fall, even without any of the floors in the way for the roof to fall. The only explanation is it turns to dust.
Okay. And just further to that point, there's something called the protective bathtub, right? That protected Manhattan from flooding.
And it wasn't destroyed.
All right.
It still held. And it was a day or two after the event when they brought in earth-moving equipment, and that began to damage the bathtub wall. That's sort of a dike that keeps the Hudson River out of the basement of the towers.
Right. So one would expect that, given the size, you would expect seismic activity when a building that large falls to the ground, that it would have ruptured or damaged the protective bathtub and the East River or the Hudson River. Excuse my ignorance of the geography. I'm not from New York, but the water would have come. The Hudson River would have come pouring in.
Yeah, it would have flooded all of Lower Manhattan's subway system. Didn't happen. Also, when they took down the remains of Building 6, just this little corner of Building 6, they decided they couldn't use explosives because they're afraid of damaging the bathtub wall. They used cranes and chains and pulled it down.
Now, some of the other interesting.
They're afraid it would be too damaged. But there's a whole lot of other weird things going on. We've just been talking about Tower 1, 2, and Building 7, but we can count beyond 3. Other folks don't count beyond 3, but we can here. There's 7 towers with a WTC prefix. All 7 were destroyed that day. And Building 3, what remained was a smaller percentage of the initial building than the remains of Building 7 was of its original height.
So they were all dustified in the same manner. All dustified.
Yeah, gone. And if Building 2 fell on top of it, where's Building 2? And Building 6 had a big hole in it. Like half the building was gone, down to ground level. You can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It was an 8-story building, and you can count all the way down to ground level. And the inside is just hollowed out.
The cars that you saw on the was it FDR Drive?
They're all over the place. There's over 1,400 toasted cars. I call it toasted. They're toast. They're history.
Right.
You can't fix them. You got to get another one. So there's over 1,400 toasted cars all over Manhattan. Some were moved, but most were not moved. Like there's a toasted car lot by the Embassy Suites Hotel. I've got photos of it before and after. You know, you see the nice shiny cars there, and then you see them toasted.
And why is that significant?
It's a weird phenomenon. Also up West Broadway. And when one of the towers went, the dust went up and blocked out all of the sun. And the firefighter came out of Building 7. He said he couldn't see his hand in front of his face, and couldn't see anything. And then, thank goodness, the cars started lighting up because then he could see where he was going.
Right, right. But when you say
They appeared to go
toasted
into
cars,
spontaneous combustion for no reason. He wasn't getting hit with anything.
the cars appeared to go up in spontaneous combustion.
Right. It wasn't real fire. It may have turned into that, but initially it was more like a plasma type effect. And you know, all sorts of unburned paper up and down the street.
So these scorched cars, some of them, I believe you said, were on their roof, right? They were turned upside down.
Yeah, you know, like they'd been levitated and were upside down. They weren't necessarily toasted. Those are just upside down.
And so for those who continue to argue about controlled demolition, which is, you know, it's almost like a religion, thermite or thermate or nanothermite, and that the buildings were wired 110 stories, you know, wired for a controlled demolition. You know, you and I have talked before about this, and you mentioned one of the big problems with that is New York at that time, you know, even though we didn't have smartphones, everyone had cell phones. Why is having a cell phone, why would that maybe argue against controlled demolition?
Well, come along the highway, you see signs that say turn off cell phones and two-way radio, blasting zone ahead. You know, because it might accidentally trip it. And you can't tell everybody in southern Manhattan to turn off their cell phone, not tell why, you know, for weeks on end. But still, it was a relatively quiet demise. Like Building 7, there's an interview with the EMT lady that has her back to Building 7, and the people watching, you know, the audience there while she's being interviewed, see Building 7 dropping and gasp. And she turns around, what's happened? She has no idea what just happened behind her. In other words, there was no sound for its demise. And you know, with controlled demolition, you hear bang, 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 and then you start seeing the building begin to move here and there. It's also not simultaneous. It's very timed and has to be very carefully calculated.
Right. Well, some people reported seeing and hearing what we call squibs, right? Little blasts out of the windows.
Right. It should have been even more with that much stuff being squashed down and squeezing out. But there's water tanks located every so many stories about where you saw the squirts coming out. And if you're dustifying the walls of a pressure vessel like a water tank, at some point it's going to cut loose. That water is going to come out.
So that's what people were seeing when they thought they were seeing little blasts from a controlled demolition. These squibs.
You see something squirting out there, and it very likely could be water squirting out. And it happened about every 10 stories or so where they have water tanks.
So were all of the buildings in the World Trade Center complex, all of them brought down or disappeared rather in the same manner?
This last parts, like Building 4, the whole main body is gone. You can sweep up what's left. The north wing is still there. Looked like a razor blade, sliced it off, but the rest is gone. It was right below Tower 2, and the shopping center below is still intact. Some stuff was knocked off shelves, but there's pictures of the emergency folks walking through there looking for people.
All right, we're heading into the bottom of the hour break here, Dr. Wood. When we come back, I want to talk to you also about Hurricane Aaron, which was a Category 3 storm, one of the longest lasting hurricanes, I think, on record, that was approaching Manhattan. And we'll talk about, how that might be connected to what you're talking about, the dustification of the World Trade Center towers. Dr. Judy Wood stays with us. Back with more of Coast right after these. Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Syrett, S-Y, because I love you, R-E-T-T. In the aftermath of the attacks, Canada activated Operation Yellow Ribbon to handle the diversion of civilian airline flights from the United States to airports in Canada. Of course, Gander, Newfoundland accommodated about 6,600 passengers and crew, and the story inspired the musical Come From Away. All right, astronomers using the European Southern Observatory's Very Large Telescope in Chile have captured the most detailed images yet of a dog bone-shaped asteroid named Cleopatra. New observations provided more accurate estimates for its shape and mass and show the bizarrely formed space rock is approximately 168 miles long. The recent study has also shed light on how Cleopatra's two moons, Alex Helios and Cleo Selene, were formed. You can read more and see some pretty interesting photographs as well in the highlight carousel up at coasttocoastam.com. Back to more of my conversation with Dr. Judy Wood, the author of Where Did the Towers Go?, right here on Coast to Coast AM. And we are back with Dr. Judy D. Wood, former professor of mechanical engineering and the author of Where Did the Towers Go? Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11. So something else interesting happening in and around New York at that time, 9/11, and that was Hurricane Aaron, which was a Category 3 storm. What does that have to do with the dustification of these buildings, Judy?
I don't know. It was there, and it seemed kind of unusual that they wouldn't tell us about it. But there's something I would like to point out, that the truth is known about what happened in 9/11, and it is knowable. But there's a great effort out there to cover up what happened. I saw an article, I think it was posted today, where the person is talking about justification, how that happened, and well, nobody knows and nobody will talk about it. And then he made this one statement. He said, well, Dr. Judy Wood did pursue this in her book. Her findings were too controversial to be pursued, though.
Too controversial. What does that mean in the world of science? How can something be, if it's based in science, how could it be considered controversial?
People like to talk about what's popular rather than the truth. And this is why the truth stays covered up, because there's a lot of people invested into keeping it covered up.
All right. I do want to go back.
I think it's quite good. It says, truth can have extraordinary consequences and costs, but it's even more costly if you run from it.
That's an excellent quote. But I do want to go back to Hurricane Aaron, because there was some interesting things happening.
The hurricane there was unusual. And that they didn't talk about it, but it poses other questions, like why didn't they warn people? How could they be 100% sure of the hurricane's behavior so that they wouldn't tell people? Because it pulled up to the outer banks of Long Island and stopped. That afternoon, it turned around and headed out of town.
In other words, they didn't issue an evacuation order. How did they know?
Yeah, or even a voluntary evacuation. It just wasn't mentioned. It was mentioned a little bit that the seas were rough that day, but the morning media, 10 minutes to 15 minutes before the first tower got its hole, the main networks weren't talking about it.
So, do you have evidence to suggest that perhaps that hurricane was steered away by the same technology used to dustify these buildings?
I'm not going to speculate on that. I'm just making the comment that it implies something. The fact that they were, 100% sure of what the hurricane's behavior was, to the point they didn't tell anybody. Yet they tell us that, nobody knows where hurricanes go. So why wasn't anybody warned that day? It implies that they have a reason for knowing 100% sure that it was going to turn around.
All right, so let's talk about the technology that could turn over 1 million tons of building material into dust.
Well, as I said, I talk mainly about evidence, whether it's parallel evidence or direct evidence of what happened and what could not have happened, what you can rule out. And that's so important, because once you know what happened, then you can figure out the rest much easier. But the fact that it's being covered up is a problem. You know, this organization, 9/11 Truth Movement, they've had my book for over 10 years. So they don't have any excuses. But they still can't count past 3. They just talk about 3 buildings, not the fact that the whole building went away. But this also brings up another issue. I'm sure you've heard of the Ash conformity experiment.
No, I haven't.
A simplified version would be if you have a room full, a bunch of people around a table, and you ask them the answer for 2 plus 2. And this guy says 5, the next one says 5, the next one says 5. Then they get to the test subject, and he says 4, and then looks around like he's going to get in trouble. And pretty soon, after a few more rounds of this, he goes in and joins in and gives the wrong answer, because he thinks that either they know something he doesn't know, or he wants to just be liked by them.
Right.
And that can control a whole lot of people in society. It really confuses people, and they just don't know the difference between right and wrong anymore, don't know the difference between truth and false.
Okay,
So
but when you look at the evidence...
To stress evidence.
Okay, so when you look at the evidence, you see patterns that are consistent with directed energy power. Is that true?
Well, I see a parallel evidence, but if you look at the cover of my book, you see, this big dust fountain where all the material is just spreading out into dust. And think about what that could be used for. I mean, that's an amazing amount of energy being released.
Right. Okay. So are we talking about what, force fields?
Well, we see the evidence that something is going on with that material. Something told that material to act differently than it normally does. The energy in that material was instructed to do something differently than it normally does. Instead of the atoms being attracted to each other, they suddenly started repelling each other. Now, that's a pretty amazing piece of technology that can do that. And somebody has it.
Is it related to the work of Tesla?
It could be. John Hutchison has produced, identical phenomenon by using either a Tesla coil or a Van de Graaff generator and interfering with the radio frequency signals. And we also have a natural version of that most people are aware of, which is tornadoes. You get levitation, you get, destruction. Some weird destruction with tornadoes.
Right. Yeah. Hutchison was working with huge voltages of power and electricity, rather, and was seeing these. Well, he called it the Hutchison effect. These weird effects. Metal would become rubbery. As you say,
that reminds me of another
levitation.
Evidence that I was, I'm going to have on the webpage. It's this Bible artifact that was found. It's in the museum in New York. That it looks like a Bible that's embedded in steel and concrete, with a formerly liquid piece of metal that ran down the page and then stopped. There's no burn marks on that paper.
This was an artifact found at Ground Zero.
Yep.
No scorch marks on the paper, and yet you had molten metal running down its page.
Well,
one of the pages.
Solidified metal running down the page. That's some pictures I'd sent in. I wanted to have on the webpage. and it's in the whole Bible thing is embedded in steel and concrete. When the Pope came, he came to visit it, and he didn't look at it. He just kind of closed his eyes and said some prayers. But how could anybody look at that and not wonder what the heck's going on?
Right, right.
You had this little river of molten material coming down, or liquid metal that solidified on the page, and there's no burn marks on the paper. Now that isn't what you see with super duper thermite.
Right. You've had special interests in things like optical interferometry and photomechanics.
The interference of optics.
Right.
And
So
using that to measure deformations of materials.
So these were interests that you had in physics before 9/11, right?
Correct.
So how do they apply then to your study of 9/11?
Well, looking at material properties. For example, there's this guy walking home after the towers have gone poof, and he's wading through dust, and he's kicking it up, and it's staying aloft. But you notice the air is completely clear above his knees. So, just being observant, you realize that dust is so fine it hangs in the air. Well, then how the heck did it settle out of the air? It implies that it was coarse dust that landed and became fine dust because it kept breaking down.
Right, right.
So
I find it
learning how to observe things. A lot of people wouldn't have picked up on that, but it's observing material properties.
I just find it's interesting how your academic background almost led you to this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's a coincidence?
Well, a lot of people have different ideas, like why I'm here. And
what is your idea?
needed to do this.
Right.
And still, it's not being heard. It's so easy to run a cover-up. And every person participating in the cover-up is a criminal. It's horrible. It's what it's doing to our world. And if folks had figured out, what happened on 9/11, we wouldn't be having this other shenanigans going on now. This is another psyop.
You had a former student who was murdered. I believe was that connected to what she revealed in the book? Do you think?
Yeah, the student was murdered, but I want to focus on what happened. I don't want because her student was murdered, then she must be telling the truth. But what I say and the evidence I present stands on its own.
Now, the book came out in 2010, right? Early 2010.
Yeah.
So here we are 11 years later. Has new information surfaced that further reinforces the evidence in your book? Could we see another edition, an updated edition at some point?
It's not really, nothing's changed, except it gets covered up more and more. And if somebody posts my name on Facebook, the post gets deleted.
A lot of that going on these days.
Yeah,
a lot of that going on.
Yeah, and other people, if you mention thermite, you don't get deleted. It's really quite interesting. Now, Richard Gage had hired a guy in Alaska to do a model. I like to point out 9/11, climate change, and COVID. All three of them were run by models of hypothetical situations. And then we have this guy in Alaska running another model to show something about Building 7. But what he said in his final report was quite interesting. If you look at what he really said, it is our conclusion based upon these findings that the collapse of WTC-7 was a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of all columns in the building, and not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns throughout the building. Controlled demolition is sequential. So right there, he said it couldn't be that. And if something's dustifying, it's a near simultaneous failure. He also added later, he said, it's the first time I've I've seen a failure come down where the concrete was powder instead of broken chunks.
Remarkable, remarkable. So
But then
why?
he's paid to say it was controlled demolition, so he goes with that, which is, that's horrid. People
Why are so many married to this idea of nanothermite? I mean, is that even a thing, nanothermite?
In a way, yes. Nano just means it burns faster. It's the same amount of stuff, but the military uses it and should have used it in Afghanistan. Because if they have to clear out, what they do is set out a thermite grenade that burns all the paperwork in their room instantly. That's what it's used for.
So what's next, Dr. Judy? What are you pursuing next?
Well, people don't seem to want to know the truth. They'd rather cover it up.
Well, you're here now with us.
Right. You're getting out some, but others, like for example, David Chandler has had a copy of my book for over 10 years. Yet he likes to claim that it's wrong, but he's never refuted anything in it. Nobody has refuted anything in it.
Well, I'll ask him about it. He's coming on a little bit later in the program.
Yeah.
I can ask him about that.
And Richard Gage wanted to refute it. He couldn't, so he made up some disinformation about it and then refuted his own disinformation. That's what folks do when they're desperate. But why don't they want to know the truth? Why is it so important to them to cover it up?
Is it still possible to get the book? Is it still available?
Yes, still available. You get it on Amazon or on my website, wheredidthetowersgo.com.
Wheredidthetowersgo.com. All right. Well, what can we do other than keep, hammering away at this, Judy, and provide a platform for you to talk about it? And
just keep in mind, people, that the truth has consequences, but running from it is far more costly. And the more people that run from it, I think, that's sort of what's been going on. People were scared on 9/11, and they got that fear going. And when people get fear going, they want a relief from the fear. So they do whatever, like go with the flow, like the Ash conformity experiment. They go with the flow, whether it's right or wrong, just to get relief from the disharmony.
2 + 2 is 5.
Then, like what's going on now, worldwide, is scary that, people don't think logically anymore.
All right. Well, we'll direct them once again to the website, wheredidthetowersgo.com. Wheredidthetowersgo.com. Judy, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for hanging out.
Well, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Dr. Judy Wood. All right. When we come back, the author of the most dangerous book in the world will be here. Welcome back. Well, it's coming up next, the author of the most dangerous book in the world, and he'll detail how 9/11 served as a black mass, an homage to the godfather of the modern satanic movement, Aleister Crowley. My conversation with Kent Bain is next on Coast to Coast AM. From 1995 to 2001, S.K. Bain was an art director of the now-defunct Weekly Standard magazine, which at the same time was published by media mogul Rupert Murdoch's New Corp America. Bain worked in the heart of Washington, D.C. with Fox News' Tucker Carlson and the New York Times columnist David Brooks, among other journalistic luminaries. During part of that time, the now infamous Project for the New American Century was co-located with the publication, and next door was the Philanthropy Roundtable, where Bain art directed for Philanthropy magazine. The Roundtable was then under the leadership of John P. Walters, who went on to become President George W. Bush's drug czar. Prior to this, Bain was an art director for the Oxford American magazine during the mid-90s, when it was published by best-selling author John Grisham and located in Oxford, Missouri. More recently, Bain helped establish the Oxford, Mississippi. More recently, Bain helped establish the Mississippi Hills National Heritage Area and author portions of U.S. public law 111-11. We'll explain the significance of that in a few moments. The release of Bain's first book, the most dangerous book in the world, 9/11 as Mass Ritual, took place on September 11th, 2012, and subsequently a series of unfortunate incidents befell its author. I guess we'll refer to you as Kent rather than SK. Is that okay?
That sounds good. That's perfect.
All right, Kent, welcome to the program. How are you?
Good. It's fantastic to be here.
Likewise. We should also mention the book with contributions from Peter Levenda, who's been on the program before. What's interesting, I mean, you make a very compelling argument in this book that 9/11 was this mass mind control operation, a psyop, if you will. It had some occult ritual components. And yet you went into this book really as a skeptic trying to disprove this whole idea. So what was it? Was there anything in particular that turned your thinking around 180, or was it simply the preponderance of all the evidence?
The latter, the preponderance of evidence, the cumulative weight of the evidence that 9/11 was more than a terrorist attack, certainly more than a false flag attack, but also an occult ritual with a wide variety of occult symbols and significant numbers incorporated into it.
So when you're sort of reconstructing the events, whether we're talking about the World Trade Center towers in New York or the Pentagon in Washington or the down plane near Shanksville, do you see occult markers for all of them?
No, I do, and it certainly didn't see them initially. Only after quite an extended period of I guess, awakening and research was I able to see those occult elements. But practically every single aspect of 9/11 had an occult tag or marker, an occult element incorporated into it, and I detail each one of them meticulously in the book.
Right, and when you talk about occult markers, we're talking about numbers, we're talking about symbols, we're talking about geographical locations, and how they invoke certain names, I suppose. And being a Canadian, I'm very anxious to talk to you about this, because this isn't something I even heard about before I delved into this and your work, and that is an incident that occurred up in Whitehorse in the Yukon, the territory of the Yukon in Canada. I had no idea that there was a 9/11 connection to Whitehorse. What happened there?
Well, most people are completely unfamiliar with that episode, but as you reconstruct the occult script for 9/11, you see that it was really an homage to the godfather of modern Satanism, Aleister Crowley. And there are multiple references to numbers, symbols, etc., that are extremely important within his system of Thelema. And in Whitehorse, Yukon, Korean Airlines Flight 85 landed mid-morning. The plane had been squawking the code for hijack, even though there was not a hijack situation on the aircraft. And it came down, landed at Whitehorse International Airport, and the occult connection, or the connection to Aleister Crowley there, is that Whitehorse is slang for heroin, and Aleister Crowley was a notorious heroin addict. So there are lots of elements like this that are incorporated into the script for 9/11 that I have a definite aspect of dark humor, black humor, and when you realize that and not to take it so seriously, then that helps you interpret the events.
So you mentioned it's indicative of I guess the orchestrators of 9/11 is as an indicator of their dark humor. But why go to all of the trouble? And I believe there were some F-16s that were scrambled to bring this Korean airliner down in Whitehorse. As you say, they were squawking a distress signal, a hijack signal, even though it wasn't occurring. Why go to all of that trouble? In fact, as many of us have never even heard of the incident. Uh, just so that it's like an inside joke, they can invoke the name of Whitehorse and connect it to Aleister Crowley as if it's only for their benefit. Why go to all that trouble?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that was one of the things that I wrestled with as I began to understand these things and delve into them further. The occult elements are woven into the overall script, and it just can be very difficult at first to kind of comprehend what's going on and see the purpose. It takes a while to get adjusted to.
Right. Now, the idea that this was a mass ritual, a black mass, you mentioned. What does that mean exactly, that 9/11 was a mass ritual?
That it was more than just a false flag terrorist attack. It was more than just the pretext for initiating wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that it was on a deep level, really a global magical operation. And the occult aspects that were woven into the whole script for 9/11 were part of intertwined with psychological warfare, and the whole episode takes quite a bit of time to dissect and decipher.
Right, no doubt. So let's talk about then the numbers as a marker of this occult ritual and the importance of these numbers. So the flight numbers, for example, are there markers there? So we had we had Flight 11. That was the American Airlines flight. That's the one that eventually slammed into the North Tower. We had United 175. That was the one that flew into the South Tower. American Airlines Flight 77. That's the Pentagon. And finally, United Airlines 93. That's the one that crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So 11, 175, 77, 93. Are those all important numbers? And if so, could you walk us through it?
They are. Each one of them are important and have meanings and connotations attached to them, and are specifically important within the Aleister Crowley system of Thelema. The details of each one, I spend roughly a chapter on each one, but I'll give you the summary.
Do we have him here? Oh, I think we lost him. All right, we'll try to get him back on. Kent Bain is with us, and the author of The World's Most Dangerous Book, with contributions from Peter Lavenda. And basically, the book is making the case that 9/11, as he said, was more than just a false flag operation. It was a black mass, a mass ritual, an homage to Aleister Crowley, the grandfather, or the grand godfather, if you will, of modern Satanism. Do we have you back, Kent? Are you there?
I'm here.
All right. So I know this is very involved, but maybe even just give us one or two examples. So we mentioned these flight numbers, and you say these have occult significance. These were not just picked at random, these flight numbers. So we have American Airlines Flight 11, United 175, American Airlines Flight 77, and United 93. So any of those you want to discuss, go right ahead.
Yes, 77 is held to be the number of the great goat Baphomet, which Crowley wrote extensively about. And 93 within the system of Thelema is the equivalent of will or love. And the Thelemites would use 93 as a signature in correspondence. And so those numbers in particular, they have any number of connotations attached to them, but is specifically of importance to Crowley and his system of Thelema.
So what are the architects of this mass ritual trying to do? Are they trying to please certain deities? Do they believe that these symbols and numbers actually hold power? What are they trying to accomplish invoking these symbols and numbers?
Well, you could argue that they were creating or casting a magical spell, incorporating the numbers and the symbols, that there was some type of broader magical operation at work, and casting, I guess, a spell globally, certainly, through the media, and it's so that's that.
And what did they get out of it?
Well, you can debate whether the orchestrators of the 9/11 mega ritual actually believed that these things had a practical effect, that there was a real magical effect, or whether they were just going through the motions, incorporating these things as part of a psychological warfare operation. But
would they be seeking the blessings, in other words, from these dark powers, let's call them? Were they seeking favor in exchange for, the results of 9/11, whether it's, diminished civil liberties or wars?
Yeah, you could make a case that they were seeking the blessings of the dark gods for subsequent events and subsequent, related endeavors, military enterprises, and so forth.
And is human sacrifice an essential ingredient in these rituals? In other words, blood must be spilled?
It is, and as I've discussed in a couple of chapters in the book, the Twin Towers were sacrificial, mega-sized sacrificial altars that were constructed in advance, well in advance, for the ultimate purpose that they served on 9/11.
So the Twin Towers were built with their own destruction in mind?
I think there's good evidence for that, and I think that when you look at the symbols that were incorporated into the design of the Twin Towers and the dates associated with them, the groundbreakings and so forth, you can come away with you can draw the conclusion that the planning for their destruction and their ultimate use as sacrificial altars was undertaken well in advance.
And the Twin Towers, I believe you refer to them as representing the pillars of Hermes. So twin pillars of Freemasonry. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
There were a number of symbols utilized on 9/11. The Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the Twin Towers representing supersized pillars of Hermes, or the twin pillars of Freemasonry, and those symbols were intended to assist with the magical operation.
All right. And what about Building 7? We hear a lot about Building 7. What is being invoked with this structure?
Well, in addition to the fact that media reports claimed that it had come down, a full 20 minutes before it actually came down, it was also a symbol that embodied the 47th proposition of Euclid, which is extremely important within the practice of Freemasonry. And so it was another element of the occult script for 9/11.
You also talk about its size being, or its shape rather, being significant. It's a trapezoid. Is that a Masonic symbol?
It is, and there's the order of the trapezoid.
The order of the trapezoid. All right. And we just have about a minute here before we head into the break. Just talk to me. We'll start talking about this now, and then we'll continue after the break. And that is on the 23rd floor of Building 7, and you mentioned 47 floors. On the 23rd floor, so sort of smack dab in the middle, we had the Emergency Management Office for New York. Talk to me about the significance of its placement there.
Well, it certainly provided front row seats, could have provided front row seats to the spectacle that unfolded at Ground Zero that day. And there were any number of reasons why that was a very poor location for the Emergency Management Operations Center for Manhattan, and it was a whole range of individuals had raised concerns about that, but it was front and center and front row seats for the events that occurred in the Ground Zero on 9/11.
All right, we'll take a quick time out, Kent, come back and discuss the world's most dangerous book. Back with more of my conversation with Kent Bain right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. When Facebook's CEO Mark Zuckerberg revealed that the social network was working on its first smart glasses, he tried to dial down the hype. The glasses, he suggested during the Facebook Connect conference in September 2020, would be just a step toward a more ambitious project. They're not yet augmented reality glasses, he said, referring to technology that places digital images on someone's view of the real world. They're on the road there, he said. But on Thursday, Facebook's smart glasses under the Ray-Ban brand go on sale online and at some stores in the US, UK, Canada, Italy, Ireland, and Australia. Called Ray-Ban Stories, these smart glasses shoot photos and 30-second videos with the press of a button. They also play music and podcasts and make calls. The glasses include a virtual assistant, so you can snap photos and videos hands-free by uttering the phrase, "Hey, Facebook." And there's more of this story in the news section up at coasttocoastam.com. And tonight on Coast, that's Monday night into Tuesday morning, George Norrie welcomes constitutional lawyer specializing in food and drug law, Jonathan Emord, the only attorney in history that has defeated the Food and Drug Administration 7 times in federal court. He'll discuss the state of individual rights in light of orders, mandates, and restrictions being put on citizens and businesses all over the world. In the second half, George speaks with longtime practitioner of physicism and magic. Keith Miller has studied both Western and Eastern schools of magic and a variety of divination methods. He contends the psychic ability is skill development, and that through practice you can learn to harness this ability. That's tonight on Coast to Coast AM. All right, when we come back, more of my conversation with Kent Bain, the author of the most dangerous book in the world, 9/11 as Mass Ritual, right here on Coast to Coast AM. And we are back with Kent Bain, the author of the world's most dangerous book. We were talking about the Emergency Management Office for New York City, located on the 23rd floor of Building 7. And apparently whoever decided to put it there, they were told repeatedly, that's not a good spot for it. That's not a good spot, but they insisted. And you're suggesting that was done because it provided front row seats. But for who, Ken? Who wanted front row seats? Who got those front row seats? Do we know?
I do wish I knew, and I think it would be safe to say that it was an elite group. But as to who in particular, that's anybody's guess.
But when you say front row seats, do you mean that they were there physically, or there were surveillance cameras placed there so that those images of the destruction could be transmitted back to some remote location? Because for them to be literally or physically there, I mean, that would be the end of them.
Right. It could have been cameras. That as to whether they were there in person, anybody's guess.
Right. So they would derive some satisfaction, I guess, seeing their handiwork completed. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about the date 9/11, because according to these occult practices, every date, I guess, astrologically, it has importance, right? So what is the importance of 9/11 astrologically?
The September 11th is New Year's Day on the Egyptian Coptic calendar, and it marks the first dawn rising of the dog star Sirius, which is extremely important within the system of Thelema. To Aleister Crowley.
Does that have anything also to do with? I was reading your latest blog post, and at worldsmostdangerousblog.com, I believe is the website. You were talking about 9/11 in connection with the winter solstice, galactic alignment. You also talked about the connection between other disasters, or I guess they would be considered mass rituals. Pan Am 103 in 1988, TWA 800 in 96, Swiss Air Flight 111. I know it's a complicated subject, but could you kind of maybe just simplify it, give us a crash course, and how all of these mass rituals, these disasters, catastrophes, are related and what they have to do with galactic alignment?
The Great Age, or the Great Year, Platonic Year, is approximately 26,000 years in length, and it is coming to an end this year, at the end of this year. And what I document in my last two books is how that has been in the fore of occult thinking and planning for quite an extended period of time, and I connect the dots with a lot of events, false flags, and mass rituals leading up to this most auspicious occasion that's occurring at the end of this year.
Right, and that happens on the winter solstice, right?
It does.
The sun will leave, I guess, the what do they call that? The celestial cross.
Yes.
And so once so at the strike of midnight on the celestial, well, I'm not sure if it's midnight, but on winter solstice this year, the sun will move out of the celestial cross. So that marks the end of an age that was 26,000 years in the making, right?
Right. It marks simultaneously the end of the current or old Great Age and the dawning of the new Great Age. The dawning of the new sun of the new Great Age.
Okay, and so the significance then of 9/11 and the winter solstice, is there one? Or is there a connection, I guess? Is there a connection between 9/11, September 11th, and the winter solstice?
There is, and I do my best to draw those connections in detail in the books.
Okay. How long was this in the planning?
you could make a case for decades and if not centuries.
Centuries. My word. All right. So in the aftermath of writing this book, you and your family sort of were struck with a lot of misfortune. And can you tell me a little bit about that? What happened?
Well, on the day that I signed the contract to write the first book, my mother's apartment burned to the ground, and on the anniversary of September 11th in 2013, I did a presentation with conspiracy culture bookstores in Toronto, Canada, and immediately following that, my son had his first epileptic seizure.
Oh, my. And do you attribute that to, I mean, do you think that was a result of your writing this book, The Most Dangerous Book in the World? That
I
somehow,
suspect that.
right,
Yeah.
that they were after you. They were after you.
Yeah.
And what put an end to it?
Well, I'm not entirely certain. It just came to an end.
All right. And in 2013, that was the 50th anniversary of JFK. You mentioned that you found yourself mixed up in what you called a year-long series of events. I'm guessing that's what you're describing now, that were commemorating or connected to the 50th anniversary of JFK. You called it his assassination, the killing of the King fertility right. The killing of the King fertility right. What do you mean by that?
It was ancient practice to.
Oh, great. He's gone again. I'm not sure what's happening. All right. Well, we'll. I guess we'll just push on in his absence, or we'll try and raise Kent Bain once again. The book is The World's Most Dangerous Book by Kent Bain, with contributions from Peter Levenda. And what do you think of that idea? 9/11 as a mass ritual, a black mass, and an homage to Aleister Crowley. Just a reminder, coming up at the top of the hour, we'll switch gears and we'll welcome David Chandler, who is a retired teacher, physics and mathematics, and we'll talk about Building 7. And he'll provide his evidence that Building 7 did not collapse as a result of fire, but in fact controlled demolition. All right. We don't have Kent Bain. All right. He is not picking up at this point. All right. Maybe he's been taken ill suddenly, perhaps. Not feeling well? Well, we wish him well. All right. What can we do in the next 7 minutes? I guess I can maybe recap some of the things that Kent Bain, in his absence, was saying. Again, that the dates are significant. These are auspicious astrological dates. So 9/11, I was trying to get at this with Kent. He writes about this in the book, and that is that 9/11, September 11, is 111 days from the winter solstice. And again, we talked about the significance of the winter solstice. This is when the sun, of course, is its lowest point in the sky. And we are now entering this coming. All right. The winter solstice, apparently we can't reach him. So I guess that's it for Kent Bain tonight. But the winter solstice, the sun is in the lowest point in the sky. And beginning in 1976, the sun entered, or sort of knocked on the door of the celestial cross. That's the center point of the Milky Way. And then in 1998, the sun was dead center on that celestial cross. So from 1976, it began to enter. 1998, it was exactly on the celestial cross. And then this coming winter solstice, the sun will officially leave its position on the celestial cross, marking the end of one age, which is 26,000 years in the making, and the beginning of a new age. So the idea is these occult rituals are placed in a certain time in accordance with the winter solstice. So, for example, and these are the occult markers to look for. We had the Pan Am 103 disaster over Lockerbie, Scotland. It happened in 1988. That was a marker, Kent Bain argues, 10 years from 1998, the point at which the sun was, 1988, 10 years from the 1998 marker, which is when the sun was on the celestial cross. And then, very quickly before we go to the calls, TWA 800 in 1996. If you add TWA 800, 800 plus 111 to the winter solstice, you get 9/11. It goes on and on. It's never ending, folks. It's never ending. All right, we're going to go to the phones, and we have on the wild card line, let me just refresh my screen here. Who do we have? James in Los Angeles. Welcome to the program, James.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I really appreciate it. I was actually at the 9/11 Commission public discourse hearings in Washington, D.C., and I had it out with Lee Hamilton of the 9/11 Commission. And what we're missing here is that 9/11 happened. It's obvious because of U.S. support for Israel as a primary motivation. You can look at Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and you can look at the YouTube channel, youtube.com/representative press. Again, youtube.com//representative press, and you can see the YouTube of my exchange with Lee Hamilton. It's titled "What Motivated the 9/11 Hijackers."
Well, that's one theory. I mean, that's one theory worth considering, but we're looking at others as well here. What did you make of the idea that this is some sort of mass ritual?
Well, I don't buy that. I mean, if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, it actually specifically states that it was U.S. support for Israel as the primary motivation, and we just don't. The U.S. media won't touch that, and that's the sad part about it. Americans are missing the truth. There's no controlled demolition or mass ritual. The bottom line is the Mossad was actually there on 9/11 of the day.
Well, no, listen, I don't know about that. I've heard that many times. Israel warned the United States. They tried to warn the United States, as did a number of other countries, that there was something coming, but they didn't seem to heed those warnings. That's always been peculiar to me. Glenn is in Michigan, east of the Rockies. Glenn, welcome.
Hello tonight, guys. I'd just like to bring attention to how Hollywood, actually King Kong in '79 there, dove off the World Trade Center. And then in Marvel Comics,
oh, the Empire State Building, wasn't it? Sorry, wasn't it the Empire State Building?
No, with Jeff Bridges in '79.
Oh, the remake. Okay, a remake. The original it was the Empire State Building.
Fell to his death off the World Trade Centers.
Okay.
And, he was jumping back and forth, I believe. I'd have to watch the movie again, but in Marvel Comics, the planet where the Soul Gem is, where the Red Skull is, where Gamora is thrown off by Thanos, the Destroyer, it looks exactly like the World Trade Center. And also, in the end games, I hate the spoilers for people, but Black Widow gets killed there also. And
so a bit of predictive programming. Is that what you're suggesting?
Just at Hollywood, they're in the game somehow, somewhere down the line.
Well, that whole idea of predictive programming is fascinating. Like, where does that come from? There was the Simpson episode. There was the episode of The Lone Gunman, which was a spin-off of The X-Files. There were a number of rap albums that featured the World Trade Center World Trade Center buildings on fire and so forth. Where does that come from? It's just out there in the ether. I don't believe, for example, that the head writer of The Simpsons had some intimate knowledge or foreknowledge of the event. But history is replete cultural examples of this predictive programming, and it's a fascinating area. Robert Sullivan has been on the program a number of times talking about that. He's got an interesting theory, which I won't try and share with you now because I'm not Robert Sullivan. But I love that topic. predictive programming. Let's try to squeeze in one more very quickly. Marty's in San Francisco. Hey, Marty.
He's hitting one nail on the head and missing the other, which is the concept of Islamic mathematical magic. Where does zero come from? You understand, like ground zero, the 911. Crowley picked up on that, but it goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. And also there is a whole concept of Islamic mathematical magic, which is used to calculate certain things that they want to do.
All right. Thank you for that, Mark. All right, Marty, appreciate it. Thank you for that. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk Building 7 with David Chandler. Richard Serrett, coming to you live from Old Thornhill Village, just north of Toronto. Back with more on Coast to Coast. Welcome back. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Serrett. All right, what caused the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7? What caused it to collapse? Well, the National Institute of Standards and Technology report in 2008 concluded that the fires on multiple floors in WTC7, which were uncontrolled but otherwise similar to fires experienced in all other tall buildings, caused an extraordinary event. Heating of floor beams and girders caused a critical support column to fail, initiating a fire-induced progressive collapse that brought the building down. Do you believe that? Well, David Chandler doesn't. He's joining us next. Stay with us. David Chandler has a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a Master's in Mathematics. He runs 911speakout.org, and he's best known in the 9/11 Truth Movement for asserting that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, lied in denying that Building 7 underwent freefall. He is retired from 35 years teaching physics, math, and astronomy in high school and college. Dave Chandler, welcome to Coast. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. I'm a night owl, fortunately.
Yes, very fortunate. So NIST, it took, 3 years to study what happened to Building 7. And in 2008, they released their findings. Now, what was that based on? Was it computer modeling? How did they conduct this study?
Well, they didn't base it on physical evidence because all the physical evidence basically was hauled away very shortly after the event. And that was done illegally, by the way, and there was loud protests from the fire. There was fire publication that came out with major protests and so forth. So it was there was something going on as far as a cover-up from the very get-go. And so, by the way, one factor just to throw in there, they finished in 2008. In August, they had their final draft for public comment, and that's where I stepped into the scene. And then the final draft came out after the election, so during the lame duck period. So it appears to have been time to finish up at the end of the Bush term, just before Obama came in. So as far as why it took exactly the amount of time it did, I think that has to be factored in somehow.
Right. So this extraordinary event, they talk about heating of floor beams and girders causing a critical support column, I think it was column 79,
right,
to fail. But when you look at Building 7, as the North and South Towers as well, almost falling into their own footprint, wouldn't the failure have to be of the floor beams like uniform and happen all at once in the same way for it to fall?
It wouldn't have been floor beams, it would have had to been the columns.
Or the columns, right.
Because what I measured was absolute free fall for 2.5 seconds, starting, it was like simultaneous failure across the entire building, so that if I measured the descent of both corners of the building, the northwest and the northeast corners, the two that were visible, and a point along the center, all three of those points started their free fall simultaneously within 1/10 of a second.
What does jet fuel burn at? About 1,000?
There were no jets to hit this building.
Right, but I'm just thinking about in terms of...
I don't have that number at the tip of my tongue. But by the way, the jet fuel, we're jumping to the Twin Towers for a second here. Even NIST acknowledges the jet fuel was basically consumed within the first 7 minutes. I think they said 7 minutes, first few minutes. You know those big, huge fireballs that made it so spectacular?
Yes.
That was jet fuel burning up outside the building where it was doing no harm to anything.
Right. Well,
So
my point was if
the jet fuel that was left, and
right.
basically all the jet fuel did was start office fires, and so the entire time it was burning, and the one tower, the south tower, burned for about an hour, and the other one about an hour and 40 minutes roughly, and it was all just office furnishings fueling the fire during all that time.
Well, I guess that was my point, that you're right. No jets hit Building 7. But if we're to believe that jet fuel was hot enough to melt iron in the north and south towers, and yet we had no jets, no jet fuel, what did we have burning in Building 7? Paper or building material. So,
right. Well, same thing in the north tower. By the way, I don't have the numbers at the tip of my tongue as far as the temperatures and so forth, but I do remember the jet fuel temperature is about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit lower than what it takes to melt steel.
Right.
1,000 degrees. I mean, that's way low. So the fact that they come back with saying, well, they didn't have to melt it; you just had to weaken it or soften it. But the fact is, you could see molten iron pouring out the side of the south tower just before it fell. And there were reports of pools of molten steel down in the rubble pile by the firemen who were down in there. So there was molten steel. It was not caused by jet fuel. It had to have been caused by something else.
All right. So with Building 7, falling in its own footprint, free fall, we need to get a little bit of a primer in free fall. What does that mean exactly?
Let me just say this first. If you go to my website, 911speakout.org, and the very first, in fact, in the very first paragraph or so, I refer to a 6-part paper, and it was called Freefall. And I published that on Medium.com, and it's not behind a paywall or anything. You can just go there. So if you go to my website and just look for it says Freefall there, I have a very detailed run-through on that from start to finish. And then the second video on that front page is a talk I gave at University of Colorado Boulder in 2018, I believe, and that's based on the same material. So that's probably my most concise single presentation of my research right there. But yeah, I'm just saying. So free fall free fall is like if you take out your car keys and let go, and it's not a speed. It's an acceleration. It's the rate at which gravity causes something to pick up speed as it's falling with no resistance. Now, air resistance, that's a significant factor for lightweight objects, but something the size of a major chunk of a building, air resistance is going to be pretty minimal because the weight of the stuff compared to the cross-sectional area, how much air it's encountering and so forth. It's not the air that's resisting it, it's the structure of the building.
Right, it has to fall through its own material.
Through its structure at free fall, there's just absolutely no way, apart from just removing all of the vertical support. That's why I'm saying it's the columns that had to go. And the distance through which it was in free fall was equivalent of about 8 stories. So you'd have to basically remove, not just break, but literally remove 8 floors worth of vertical support to get the effects we're looking at.
And so how do you measure the acceleration?
Okay. I have a tool. In fact, I'm into education. All right. I have it freely available right on my website. I have a link to it. Let me just go to the top here. If you go over to the References tab at the top of my web page, there's a little menu tab at the top, and one says References. Under there, it says Physics Lab. I actually have a link to where you can download the tool. I have a tutorial, and I have a little discussion of some of the basic physics right there. So anybody, if you're a student, want to do a science fair project or a project for class, or if you're a teacher that wants to actually incorporate this, you can do it. It's and it shouldn't be thought of as political. It's like looking at a public event that was hugely significant for the history of this country. And so, I mean, I just think it's perfectly legitimate. You know, they might have to argue that with their administrators. But anyway, I have it all right there. And so basically, it's a tool called Tracker. And you can import a video, and then you can step through the video frame by frame and put a mark on something, and it'll track how it moves from one frame to the other. The timing between the frames is typically a 30th of a second, and then you get the resolution of the video, whatever that is. You have to have something in the video of a known size to calibrate it, so you know how many pixels is equal to a meter, that type of thing. So there was but it takes care of that. If you just, so I, for instance, found from the literature the spacing between the floors on Building 7, and I used that. I counted down a bunch of floors, and so I said this distance here is so many meters, or you can use feet if you wanted, but you can basically get the calibration like that. And then you can literally just read it off, position as a function of time. You can get velocity as a function of time. You can you can do all kinds of physics measurements with this tool, and it's used heavily in education. And that's what I had. I had a simpler tool actually originally, but that's the kind of stuff I had available from my teaching that put me in a good position to be able to respond when I saw these. You know, the craziness was NIST was claiming, as of August of 2008, they were claiming the building came down 40% slower than freefall. That's a jaw dropper, because you can look at the building and say that is pretty darn close to freefall just by eyeballing it. And so if you actually measure it, what startled me was I was assuming that my measurement would come out, oh, if we're within 90%, about 90% of free fall or something. No, you're on the money at free fall, and it's an instant transition to free fall. So 1 second, 1/10 of a second, you're holding fast, and the very next moment, you are in free fall. And it stayed in free fall for 2.5 seconds, over 100 feet of drop, equivalent of about 8 floors.
And the other thing that stands out when you look at the video is the roof. I mean, it's level as it's going down.
Yeah. Okay. There's an interesting thing about the roof. The video I use, you saw the video I worked on,
yes.
I assume, right? Yeah.
Yes.
It's basically a camera shot that's taken from quite a ways uptown with a telephoto lens. And in fact, the camera that I'm using for my current, my most recent and most accurate versions of these measurements, there was a video camera that they had on a tripod, and then it was just sort of abandoned. It was focused, but nobody was touching it. In fact, the picture was tilted because nobody was there to level it or anything else. They were using other cameras, and this one was just sort of abandoned there. But because of the fact there was no human contact, that's the most stable video we have of the whole thing. So here we are looking level at the roof line, and it looks perfectly flat. If you go on, with a microscope, there's a little bit of variation, but it's almost flat. Now, there's another angle, which is from down on what they call West Street, looking up at the building from the street level, up at maybe a 45-degree angle. I'm not quite sure what the angle is. But you can see it looks like there's a V-shaped dip in the roof line. And so how can that be? Because the other doesn't show that dip. Well, the reason is what looks like that V-shaped dip is it's because you're looking at an angle, it's ambiguous whether it's lateral motion or vertical motion. And it turns out it's lateral because when you look at it level, it's not there. So think of taking a book and folding it, and then looking at it from below, it looks like a V. Looking at it horizontally, you don't see that, you see. So, yeah, there was things going on in the building, but it wasn't coming down. And so basically when NIST did their measurements, they're claiming they used that camera 3 angle, which was from West Street, which is that had to have been an intentionally ambiguous angle to do their measurement from. So there's a bunch of stuff they did wrong that's just transparently obvious to anybody who actually gets in and works with the data. They're not doing an honest measurement. They're basically trying to come up with a rationale to say it was not free fall, because free fall would imply a demolition. There's no way around it. And they were trying the best they could to avoid that.
Yeah, when you have a building this size, and I've seen the images on your site, overlaying it on a football field. So it's 100 meters side to side.
Yeah.
I mean, for that to fall into its own footprint the way that it did, I mean, there's no margin for error if
no
you
natural
believe
explanation for that either.
Right, but for them to NIST, that is, to suggest that it was, column failure, simultaneous. I mean, there's no room for error, not a nanosecond there. Otherwise, it would start to topple, wouldn't it?
Right. I was telling you, in fact, that's exactly right. There was an analysis done at the University of Alaska that the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth commissioned it, but it was done. The guy who did it initially wasn't even part of the Truth movement. He was professor of, I think it's structural engineering, but University of Alaska. And he had a couple of graduate students that the three of them worked on, they did 2 modelings of it on 2 different kinds of software, and they essentially reproduced the work that NIST supposedly did. And in the process, they found all kinds of flaws in what NIST did. And NIST very clearly falsified data in order to even get their model to collapse. So even if you take the measurements that we have for the building, like for instance, okay, here's the way they got their column to fail, all right? Column 79, and you have these girders that come in from the sides, and you say, well, those are butting up against this column, and therefore they help support the column and keep it vertical, okay? And then they have these beams that come into those girders, and they're saying that somehow or other, the beams that were, butted up against that girder, the fires under that floor caused those beams to expand and push the girder off of its seat, leaving the column without horizontal support. And then somehow it had to propagate down for a number of floors to leave enough unsupported to be able to claim that the column would buckle. In other words, you need a big, long, it's like a piece of spaghetti. If you take a spaghetti strand, raw spaghetti, and you push down on the top, it's going to bow and buckle and so forth because it's not supported. But if you had like a half-inch stretch of that spaghetti and you push down on it, you're just going to hurt your finger. It's stiff if it's a short span, but it becomes flexible if it's a longer span. So they basically needed to somehow figure out how to get that, in their model. In other words, they had to come up with a way how that vertical column could have buckled. And in order to do that, they left off some actual hardware that was in place. The girder that came in, not only did it come into the column, but it was between, the column had some structure to it. So it was like between the side plates on the column. You couldn't push it off of its seat because there was stuff in the way, okay? And so if you're trying to push that, it would catch. It would not freely slip off the side. Furthermore,
David, pardon my interruption. I've got to jump in here because we're going to head into a break, and we'll come back and discuss further. David Chandler is with us from 911speakout.org. We're talking about the collapse of Building 7 on the anniversary of 9/11, one day past. Back with more right here on Coast to Coast AM. Hey, welcome back. The first two rock samples examined by NASA's Mars rover Perseverance give scientists a firm belief that water inundated Jezero crater for a sustained period of time, the agency announced on Friday. We determined salt granules in the rock indicated it was exposed to water, according to Julia Goreva, a NASA scientist for the rover program. And the rocks drilled Monday and Wednesdays came from an igneous or volcanic rock. The agency previously knew that water once filled the crater, but not for how long. The salt deposits mean NASA can now rule out a sudden flash in the pan water event, the agency said in a news release, and you can read more of that in the news section up at coasttocoastam.com. Back with more of my conversation with David Chandler, who runs 911speakout.org, as we continue to discuss what brought down World Trade Center Building 7. Back with more in a moment, right here on Coast to Coast AM. We're back with David Chandler from 911speakout.org talking about Building 7. So before the break, David, we were talking about sort of the mental gymnastics that
Right.
NIST had to perform in order to sort of, make the square peg fit in the round hole regarding, the weakening of column 79 and so forth. And I think you were in the middle of making a point before the interruption.
I was going way off the rails, I think, in terms of detail. I think I can summarize very concisely the issue here is they had to lie to even come up with the parameters needed to allow even their computer model to push that girder off of its seat. It wouldn't work, and they had to change little this and change little that. They left out some parts and braces, and they just left them out of their model in order to get that to fail. Then they had to just wave their hands and said that failure propagated down through numerous floors. I think it was at least, 7 or 9 floors, something like that they had to do. And that wouldn't happen either. The guys that were the engineers that we were working with, no, it wouldn't have even crashed through one floor. Just the amount of impact, if you let it fall, it wouldn't have done that. So one thing after another, just flat out could not have worked the way they said. And then if you say column 79 in fact failed, leading to a progressive collapse like they claim, the Leroy Halsey model, which was the University of Alaska model, it showed that if you try in any way to get a progressive collapse of columns, it's going to cause the building to tip over because one end of the building is going to start coming down before the other one has let go. So, I mean, it's just implausible on many, many levels. I mean, it doesn't work on many levels. So,
I don't know if you have any insights into how NIST works and their internal structure and so forth, but when they put these reports together, I mean, were there dissenters? Do we hear from the dissenters? Have people come forward who work inside NIST and say, I didn't agree with that, I didn't sign off on that?
Well, you have to realize this was not the entire organization. NIST has an excellent reputation. It's been looked upon as a very solid source of information for the government. It's the basis of a lot of the standards for buildings and fire prevention and all kinds of things. And they're a very solid organization. However, this little thing was just a specific little team that was carved out to do this project. And the guys they brought in to head it up were just, clearly they were just political hacks. They had a predetermined agenda. They knew what they had to show. They had to defend the story from ever getting into having to claim it was freefall. Interestingly, this is actually where I and another one of the scientists that we work with, Stephen Jones, both got, they had a technical briefing conference in August 2008, and he and I were both able to get questions asked. And in responding to our questions, first of all, they were just spinning their wheels. It's actually like a comedy show to watch their responses. And you can see that on my website. But then in response to Stephen Jones's comment, they actually had to say, well, we'll fix that in the final version. So literally on video, they committed to making a change in the report. When they came out with the final version, which was, and remember, they were still claiming 40% slower than freefall, but when they came out with their final report just a couple months later, it actually had a graph in it, and you could see from the slope of the graph, it was actually admitting freefall for they said 2.25 seconds that they admitted. And there's interesting reasons for the little discrepancy. It's not a big deal. 2.25, 2.5, whatever. It was in free fall for a significant chunk of time, but they just waved their hands and said, all this is consistent with our analysis. I mean, it was just completely blatant. And they basically, that was it. They signed, sealed, and delivered. They had the report, and they walked away from it. And they have not been responsive since then. We recently put in what they call a request for correction. The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and a few individuals and so forth put in this request for correction, and I participated with that, by the way. But they just blew it off. They just wouldn't respond. And so now there's a question of maybe taking it to court and all that kind of thing to force them to respond, because they're legally obligated to respond, but they haven't. So I don't know. NIST is it's just a blatant cover-up. You can't say it any clearer than that.
So obviously the central point here then is what causes a building to fall at absolute free fall speed.
Nothing
what could cause that?
It's never happened. Right. In fact, a steel frame building like that, these skyscrapers, they've never collapsed at all due to fire. They've had little bits and pieces fall off, or they've had some structural failures that parts of it might cave in. But we're talking about total failure top to bottom. That has never happened. The only ways they've come down is by demolition or like by earthquake, but then typically it tips over or something. When you do have more concrete kinds of buildings, there have been failures where the concrete pancakes down and so forth. But these were steel-framed buildings, and the steel is designed to resist that, and it didn't. I mean, it's mind-boggling to even contemplate. Why, for instance, were all of those firemen and all of those fire chiefs who were directing the firemen, they set up their command post inside the North Tower? And why would they do that unless they were completely confident that they were safe, being in this steel frame building? And they sent people way up in the buildings. They wouldn't do that if it was like a wooden structure that had chances of collapse. But they knew that these kinds of buildings wouldn't collapse. But the fact that they did tells you it was not an ordinary collapse. Everything about it is totally implausible without assuming that there's the use of, there's a couple of different terms. There's explosives and there's incendiaries, and there's some combination of those. You have to somehow cut through steel columns and blow them out. So if you just watch the buildings come down, if you watch the towers come down, you see floor after floor after floor of material blowing out of the building. I mean, it's just visually, you can see something is happening that's not right. The thing that first got me started in terms of even investigating all this is I was watching a video of the North Tower collapse, and I couldn't believe how much it was billowing outward. And I actually noticed that there was a chunk of stuff there that was being thrown horizontally all the way across the street and either into another building or behind the building or something. And this was way back at the very beginning of my looking at this, and I just literally freeze framed the video. This was literally on a videotape that I had way back at that early stage, or maybe it was a DVD, but in any case, I just literally froze the frame, and I used a ruler on the television screen and used that to estimate the speed of this stuff. And this was like a multi-ton chunk of material moving up close to 60 miles an hour horizontally. And it came from a part of the building which was not even moving that fast downward at that time. It was going out horizontally faster than neighboring material was going straight down. Now, that's what hooked me.
Was that propelled by one of these squibs?
No, I'm talking about a panel, a chunk of material that's, they have these panels that have 3 column sections with a couple of braces across them, and each one of those is about 4 tons. We're talking about something like that flying at 60 miles an hour horizontally.
My word.
And I since then went back with my tracker material and measured several of these, and one of the pieces I measured was going upward of 70 miles an hour. I mean, there's something happening to propel these large chunks of stuff horizontally at those kinds of speeds. You don't see that happening in a quote-unquote building collapse. You're going to have stuff maybe falling down inside and outside and so forth, but it's not going to be going 60 miles an hour horizontally.
All right, let's go to the phones, David. East of the Rockies, Rich is in Biloxi, Mississippi. Rich, welcome to Coast. Rich?
Yes.
Do we have Rich there? Go ahead. You're on the line with David Chandler.
All right. Yeah. It's good talking to you guys. A great show. But real quick, I firmly believe that the planes were used strictly as a diversion on the towers to mask that they were basically explosives that brought the buildings down.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, too, how long would it take, approximately would you estimate to wire up Building 7 with explosives prior to it coming down? Let's just say that's the case that they demolished the building. How long would that take to wire it with explosives?
Well, planning it and executing it, those were huge buildings. I'm not talking about just Building 7. I'm talking about all of that. The whole thing was one big operation, and it would have taken most likely on the order of months. However, you might say, well, maybe you could accomplish it in the period of weeks, not months. But if you're just one day ahead of 9/11, 2001, that's foreknowledge. As soon as you say anything happened in furtherance of what happened here, excuse me, even if it's one day ahead of time, it means it was not a surprise attack. And therefore, any foreknowledge of any sort implies that the planes were basically a cover-up for what was really happening. So in my mind, it's not critical to know just how long, but it would definitely be minimum weeks to do it. And given the size of those buildings, every one of those floors in both buildings, actually, they're different shapes, but they're approximately the same area. It's about an acre per floor. And so it's like 100 meters across in the case of Building 7. It's 64 meters square in the case of the 2 towers. But those are such huge buildings that there was so much they had to do to prepare. There was the one thing that's sort of referred back to quite often is there was this elevator repair that was going on for the full 9 months, dating all the way back to the beginning of the Bush administration. There was 9 months worth of elevator repair in the Twin Towers. If you have access to the elevator shafts, all you have to do is you haul your stuff in there, put out orange cones, and you're invisible. And you can make a lot of noise. You can do all kinds of stuff. You're part of the urban landscape. And you have access to all of the central columns of the building. The columns in the north and south towers were all concentrated toward the center. And within that central area, you had a bunch of elevator shafts. And so by riding the elevators, just get on the roof of the elevator, you can reach and have contact with all of the central columns all the way up. So it's easy access in a way that you would not be paid attention to. It's not that nobody's going to notice, but how many times, if you ever worked in an office building, do you really pay attention to workers that are fixing wiring or plumbing or whatever they might be doing? They're in the buildings all the time doing repairs and stuff, So they had ample opportunity to do this over the months preceding.
Do we know what happened to that elevator company? When I think of an elevator company, I think of Otis. I can't even name another elevator company.
That's who built the elevators in the World Trade Center.
Right.
And yet, just prior to all of this, I'm not sure exactly when the transition occurred, but they did not renew Otis's contract, and they hired some company called Ace Elevator. And I don't believe that company is in existence anymore. My personal hypothesis, and this is speculation, but I think it's pretty reasonable, and you can speculate on your own, is it's a front company. It was sort of put together for the purpose of doing this job, and then it just sort of evaporates. Go look up Ace Elevator, see if you can set up an elevator contract with them. I don't think you'll find them.
Right. I guess the name Acme was taken by Wile E. Coyote, so they had to go with Ace.
Huh? Oh, no, that was Acme, I think, that Wile E. Coyote was involved with.
Exactly. Yeah. They couldn't go with Acme because it was taken.
A lot like that, doesn't it?
It does. All right, we'll take a time out, top of the hour. David, stay put. We'll come back, take some more calls. David Chandler stays with us as we continue to delve into the mysterious collapse, freefall collapse of Building 7 on 9/11. Stay with us right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Authorities in Tennessee were left scratching their heads on the weekend after reports of a mysterious explosion. The alarm was raised on Saturday evening when a number of local residents called up the Clarksville Police Department's 911 dispatch center to report hearing a loud, unidentified explosion across many parts of Montgomery County. The force of the blast was so great that in some areas people reported feeling the ground shake. The source of such an event should have been relatively easy to track down. However, the mystery only deepened when neither the Clarksville Fire Department nor the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office were able to determine what had caused the explosion or where it had even taken place. To further add to the mystery, there were no reports of damage or injuries anywhere in the area. Investigation into the incident remains ongoing, and you can read more of that in the news section up at coasttocoastam.com. More of my conversation with David Chandler from 911speakout.org and your questions and comments as we continue to delve into the mysterious collapse of Building 7 on 9/11 right here on Coast to Coast AM. David, the Office of Emergency Management for New York City on the 23rd floor of Building 7. I know now we're getting into the area of speculation, but is that significant that it was in that building, and did it perhaps play a role somehow in the collapse?
Who knows? The fact that they had that indicates, they were supposedly cognizant of issues with safety in terms of all the high rises, I assume, in that area. But there's really no way to know. I mean, maybe one of the reasons people say, why did they take down Building 7? And because the towers, why didn't they just let it go at that? Why did they have to take this one down too? Well, the guy who owned the building, or actually was the long-term lease holder for that, they had plans already for the replacement building before 9/11. Larry Silverstein talks about that. I don't know, getting rid of this albatross of a building and putting a new one in place could easily, this is all speculation, I guess it's not the physics of it here, but there was all kinds of stuff going on in the background. Why did they take it down? Well, if there was some coordination going on from either there or elsewhere in the building, there were lots of secretive offices and agencies that had offices in that building. getting rid of all of that evidence would be probably part of the agenda. And all of that, presumably, NIST says they didn't retain any identifiable pieces of Building 7. There are a couple of pieces that have been identified as part of Building 7, although they have made that statement that they didn't have any. But it's like, why would they scrub the crime scene so thoroughly? They literally hauled that steel away and melted it down. So something is going on, and the fact that Building 7 was brought down at all probably has to do with destroying some sort of evidence. I mean, that's the best that I can assume.
Right. All right, let's go back to the...
really just make any statement that anybody else couldn't speculate on just as well, so I don't know.
All right. Let's go back to the phones, and Barbara is in Lakeland, Florida. Barbara, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. David, you just mentioned Larry Silverstein. That's exactly who I was going to mention. Have you seen his partial interview on online at all when he talks about they made the decision to pull Building 7?
Yeah, that's a very famous little snippet there, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not quite sure why NIST would be denying anything when Silverstein, who is the leaseholder, or was the leaseholder at the time anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things is that appears to have been just a seat of the pants, momentary thing he came up with, because that's not consistent with any realistic scenario. There's no way that the fire department could have wired and brought down that building on the same day when there's already fires going on in the building. And it's a lot of work and a lot of engineering to bring a building down, and this would have been one of the largest demolitions ever. I mean, all three of the demolitions. So it's clearly something that was set up long in advance. So the idea that they made a last-minute decision to pull the building down or something like that is just part of a cover story. So, and it's not a very well-coordinated cover story because it didn't agree with anybody else's version either. So.
All right, Barbara, thank you for that. Let's say hi to, let's see, we're going to go to Tom in Riverside, California. Tom, good morning and welcome.
Well, thanks for taking my call, Richard. And David, I'd want to ask about, I think there was a report by the news that they had jumped the gun on that Building 7 and reported it coming down. But that's another thing. The main thing I wanted to say was that what's really amazing about all this, it goes along with a lot of other things that's been going on for the last 50 years. It's not the buildings coming down. It's not the magic bullet that killed John Kennedy. It's not the other people that shot during Robert Kennedy, or the COVID and all the other conspiracies. What's really amazing is that in this country I grew up in, that the 9/11 truth and the Oath Keepers and these other groups, NRA, don't band together and demand an investigation. That's it.
Well, we've been demanding an investigation for a long time. It hasn't happened beyond what they've already done. But there needs to be. I'm not sure what it would take. I mean, the idea of asking for a new investigation. One of probably the largest organized group around 9/11 would be Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and the petition they put out was asking for a new investigation. I'm actually. They've been introducing me here as in terms of my website, but I'm actually the coordinator for Scientists for 9/11 Truth, which is another organization. In fact, if you go to scientistsfor911truth.com, that's the website for that group. But it's not just a new investigation. In a sense, we're doing the investigation, and it's that there needs to be a groundswell around all of this. I'm not sure it's ever going to happen in my lifetime. I mean, look at the Kennedy assassinations, like you mentioned. It's an ongoing issue that we have a government that apparently engages in these kinds of things, false flag things that are actually orchestrated from somewhere within the government. It's not necessarily, it's not the government as a whole, but it's like agencies or groups or people within the government that are involved in all of this. You can't, there's really no way that you can absolve the Bush administration from their role in making 9/11 happen. It's visible in the setup of the whole thing as well as in the cover-up.
All right, let's see. Let's go to Terry. He's in rural Ohio. Terry, good morning. Welcome to Coast.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Richard. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Great show, by the way. Thank you. I wanted to offer a proposal to you as to what brought the buildings down. I don't believe it was the airplane fuel because it does not burn hot enough. I believe it was the same principle by which a microwave oven operates, which is to stimulate and accelerate the vibration of water in a microwave oven. If you had a resonant frequency generator, and it would have to be very powerful, very intense, and focused, you could actually do the same thing with the molecular structure of steel. And simultaneously, you would evaporate the water in the building too. And it would cause a freefall collapse. And it's technology that's been theorized in science fiction for years. It's the same technology in Star Trek that was called disruptor technology that was used by the Klingons.
All right.
Well,
any thoughts on that, David?
I think if you're going to propose something like that, you need to show feasibility, and it would be incumbent if you're the one who's putting this idea forward. You have to come up with some sort of evidence or some sort of mechanism, some sort of a way to make it a plausible hypothesis. I work on the basis of science, and the evidence that we do have concrete evidence of the fact that nanothermite was used, and ordinary thermite was apparently also used, but there was also probably explosives. The thermite is easier to detect because it leaves a residue that we're able to identify. So that's what we've identified. We're not saying that's the only thing that was used. But the idea that it was brought down by some novel means, well, you can wave your hands and say anything you want, but you need to somehow show that if you think that's a plausible mechanism, you sort of need to do a demonstration of the plausibility somehow.
Terry, thank you for the call. Once you demonstrate that the free fall was caused by some outside power energy source, does it really matter at that point? Then it becomes almost like you're counting blades of grass on the grassy knoll. You know what I mean? Right. Like the details. Once you've demonstrated that it had to have been controlled demolition, does it really matter what the actual agent was?
Right. That's all becomes secondary. It's important to establish what it is in terms of what does the evidence show actually happened because of establishing the plausibility. If you just the same idea, to say that it was explosives or whatever, something had to clear it out. You can see evidence that it was explosives, and so that helps to establish that something was used to clear out the building underneath where it was falling. So, by the way, I did my analysis not only of Building 7, but of the North Tower. That's the one with the mast on top. And yes. If I track the roof line of the North Tower, it came down not at free fall, but it came down at 2/3 of free fall. But it was accelerating the entire time that roof line was visible, which it means there's a little more math in the background, but it has the same exact implications, that it could not possibly be the falling material that's doing the crushing. It was something clearing the way ahead of the falling chunk of the building. So in any case, all of the buildings were they're set up in slightly different ways because the geometry of the buildings were different, but all of them, it's very clear indication that there was the use of demolition technology.
And why just 2/3 free fall speed? Why?
Well, it didn't. Well, I'm not sure why, except for the fact that you can measure that that's what it did. I'm using my tracking software again, and you measure it. The thing is, it was not completely cut free to just drop. It was mostly cut free, so there's remnant amounts of support that it was having to buckle some stuff as it came down. But they took out they literally had to take out the calculation I did is they had to take out about 90% of the support in order for it to fall at the rate that you observe.
Okay.
So that's sort of what's going on there.
All right. Let's say hi to Michael is in Virginia Beach. Michael, welcome to Coast.
Thank you so much, Richard. You've done a great service for America tonight and for the whole world. And in that regard, I don't think anybody does it as well as you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Bringing together the really critical issues, breaking down the details, but there's something missing. When I was in high school and college, I participated in the Oregon-style debate. Most of my friends and colleagues became lawyers who were on the debate teams that I participated in. And that is what we have established in this country in determining the truth. It's our forensic method. Now, Coast to Coast is, without a doubt, the most courageous media program in the history of America.
Okay, Michael, pardon the interruption, but we're approaching the bottom of the hour. Could you get right to your question for David Chandler, please?
Judy, we've heard David. We need an Oregon-style debate, and we need to focus on the fact that there has been a cover-up. That's where the two corroborate each other, both Judy and David. That's what we need to deal with, the cover-up and how we're going to find and punish the people who did it.
All right. Well, David is here speaking as a scientist and looking at the physics of freefall. All right. Michael is gone. All right. Let's see. I think we can. Let's see. Ralph is in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Ralph, welcome.
Yes, I have a couple questions here regarding building number 7. I remember hearing on the media that there were reports that building number 7 was damaged by the towers. I don't know if metal was falling on top of it or whatever, but it was a hazard to the workers there, so they intentionally destroyed it. I don't know if anybody remembers that from the media report at that time, but that's
we've sort of addressed that, Ralph. We talked about Larry Silverman, who was the Silverstein. Thank you, David, and his remark that we decided to pull it, but as David has explained, you just can't simultaneously decide to pull a building. It takes, it could take months to to wire a building for demolition.
Can I add something to that?
Please do.
Yeah. There's a group also called Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. And one of the videos they put together is called, I think it's Calling Out Bravo 7 or something like that. It's very, very close to that title. And that has a very interesting commentary on a lot of these issues as well. I think that's one of the best videos out there. I think people might want to watch. And so as far as one of the comments, the thing that prompted me to say that is that they said, the fire department is not in the business of demolitions. Like the whole idea that the fire department would decide to pull the building is ludicrous to a firefighter because that's not what they do. And they don't have the expertise for it, and they're not trained to do that. They're in the business of saving buildings.
All right, Ralph, thank you for that. And I'm trying to remember if it was Silverstein or someone else who was trying to explain away that comment. who suggested that what was meant by pull it meant to pull the firemen, to pull the firemen out of the building.
Essentially, that's just what you call CYA, you know? There's no...
All right. Well, we're at the bottom of the hour here. David, hold on. We'll come back and take some more calls as we continue to discuss the collapse of Building 7 on 9/11. Stay with us here on Coast to Coast AM. David, that study, a report that came out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks in, I think it was 2019, so 2 years ago, did that gain any traction in the media?
I think it got a fair amount of attention, but not, nothing. I mean, the media has been so solid, mainstream media has been so solidly into broad brush painting everything that talks about alternatives to the official story as being this wild-eyed conspiracy theories and stuff like that. They're really into not allowing anything like this to gain traction. That is very solid research that should be considered, but basically it just gets sort of avoided. And it's not just the media. Even like in academia, it's been so marginalized over years of propaganda that any such inquiry is not legitimate, that it's very hard to gain traction. So I don't know how much traction we're going to get, but my response when people ask why I'm still at it is, hey, I'm just putting it out there because it's our duty to really find out what the truth is and put the truth out there. And things will happen. History changes, breakthroughs get made, and you don't know exactly what's going to precipitate that. The University of Alaska study was definitely answering some of the questions that were left hanging. And so it was an excellent thing to put on the books. And no, it didn't turn the whole story around, but they're not allowing that to happen.
All right. Well, speaking of Fairbanks, we've got Mike joining us from Fairbanks, Alaska. Mike, welcome. Good morning.
Hello, Richard and David. I have two very important questions. Number one, I admire your guts and patriotism, Mr. Chandler. I've been following you for years and passing the word along. And I wanted to know, this is question one, I wanted to know if you have received any type of threats.
I haven't personally. There's a number of the main people in the movement who have lost jobs. There's a few people who we have very strong suspicions died mysteriously. Barry Jennings, for instance, who worked in Building 7. He had a mysterious death just before the Building 7 report came out, and it's hard to believe that wasn't somehow an orchestrated kind of a situation to get him out of the way. But
wow.
I personally haven't had any direct threats. There are people who harass me. There's from a number of angles. All of the organizations, at least the large organizations, they've been infiltrated from day one. It's not to say that nothing that comes. AE 9/11 Truth is the biggest one out there, and I was actually working closely with them early on, and we were fighting off infiltrators and having to deal with getting them out of the group, even in the early days. And it's an issue that doesn't go away. So you have to be vigilant towards that kind of thing. But that's what happens when you have anything that has the potential to cause any kind of a real revelation or real change,
Yes,
Mike, I think you
probably one of the most important broadcasts that Coast to Coast has ever put on, and I really appreciate it, Richard. And number two, I think the Oklahoma Federal Building was also brought down by a fifth column. There was an Army general that studied explosive footprints and patterns for 29 years. They brought him in, and he said right off the bat, how are these immense column-based buttresses out in the street? They flew outwards from the street, and he said the only way that could happen is with thermite, possibly, and a detonation charge. And he wanted 1 month more to study the demolition pile and debris pile footprint. And they said no. They pushed it up, and they started the demolition within 1 week. And at the same time, Louis Freeh was an FBI director through all of these catastrophes. If you search the catastrophes that we've had from Ruby Ridge all the way to the towers collapsing, Louis Freeh resigned just before 9/11. And it's funny that he donated $1 million to the Clinton Foundation, but that's another story. But I really appreciate your time that you put into this, David, and you are a national hero, in my opinion. But I will take your comments off air. Thank you, guys, and have a great evening. I mean, all things considered, have a great evening.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, thank you for that. So, Oklahoma Fed building, do you see any similarities?
I recommend that people look up on the internet. You can find it. Kevin Ryan gave one of the first talks that he gave that I was even aware of. He did an interesting analysis of who did the investigating for Oklahoma City, and then for the FEMA investigation, the World Trade Center, and later for the NIST and so forth. The same group of people were in all of these investigations. So that sort of gives you a hint that Oklahoma City was a big cover-up as well.
Right. All right, Mike, thank you for that. Let's see. Bill is in Los Angeles. Bill, welcome to Coast.
Hi, Richard and David.
Hi.
I think there's a rational middle ground to explain the good data that David has cited. And that came the other night, to my surprise. There was a guest, Peter Lance, the author, journalist, on with George Norrie, and he suggested that the two main towers did indeed fall because of the jet impacts, but that Building 7, he said with good information, housed possibly a CIA facility that was preset for demolition, not out of some conspiracy theory to hide evidence of something, but to keep classified documents from falling into the wrong hands. And once they saw the building was threatened, they demolished it in order to avoid that, kind of to avoid like a 1979 situation where our documents were compromised when the Iranians took over our embassy. So, and also I have a friend who's a structural engineer that we happened to have visited the Twin Towers in '79, and he called me after 9/11, and he said there was nothing mysterious about the way the towers pancaked, and he owns a international retrofit company. So I think we need to watch the conspiracy stuff because it can kind of get out of hand. Like the last caller, I think that was way off bounds. So that's my middle ground.
Okay.
All right.
Number one, I want to dissociate myself from Judy Wood. If you want to see what I think of her, look at my website. I have a little section in there on discredited theories. So I make it perfectly clear there. So sorry about that. You had a different guest on. But no, I'm not in agreement with her. As far as the towers being able to come down because of the jet plane impacts and all that, there's no way. The analysis I and others have done, well, there's a guy, I have a link in my references on my website named Tony Zambodi, and he and a few other engineers did the calculations on the collapse of the North Tower and opposed to the idea that it would crush down and somehow be a self-sustaining demolition. It turns out that if you actually do the calculations, it would have been the collapse would have been arrested within one floor. So it's no way that even if you somehow took out an entire floor, the top section crashing down onto the bottom would not self-perpetuate all the way down. So, and the fact that my contribution to this was measuring the roof line, and the fact that it was accelerating downward the entire time is literally there's proof involved there that it could not be what is causing the material under it to fail. It had to have been falling into pre-pulverized material, and the calculations that implies is about 90% of the underlying support had to have been removed. So I don't buy the idea that there was a natural collapse for the towers. It just doesn't work.
Bill, thank you for that. Well, he mentioned pancaking. There really wasn't any pancaking.
No, the pancaking was an early theory that NIST later rejected because, the structure of the towers, you have these core columns. They have 47 core columns. They were massive. They went up and they gathered them toward the center of the building, leaving lots of acreage for the office space. And then they have the perimeter columns. So very stiff perimeter columns, and then you have these core columns. Had the floors pancaked, it would have left that core structure. It was like a building within a building. And it wouldn't have brought the whole structure down. But what you saw, the very first thing that came down was the tower, was the antenna on top of the North Tower. That actually started down a fraction of a second ahead of the roof line. And that is supported by the hat truss that was connected to the core columns. How could that come down without having all of those core columns taken out underneath it? So from the very get-go, it's not something that was a cumulative thing. From the very get-go, the core columns were basically blown out. I mean, hey, I've gone into this for a long time, and all my thinking on the subject is on display at my website, and then there's others there. I have links to a lot of the best material there. So, yeah, it's not at all plausible that the towers came down naturally. Just having somebody, I work with a lot of structural engineers and physicists and other people in these organizations, and just to have someone, come up with a seat of the pants estimate, I can understand that. No, we've looked at this very carefully over a long period of time. There's no way that the towers came down by any kind of a natural collapse.
Well, I remember seeing an interview maybe on YouTube. It was the architect of the World Trade Center towers, and they talked about how they had built it specifically to withstand the impact. I'm not sure what type of a Boeing plane
they had the
it was.
precedent that the Empire State Building got hit by a plane. And so since these were sticking up even higher, they made a special point of making sure that what they built would sustain the impact of the largest plane of the day, which is the 707, which is not that much different, actually, from the 767 that hit it. So, they're very comparable mass, and the energy of the impact and all that would be very comparable. But he said you could have multiple impacts, and it would just be like, he described it like poking a pencil through a door screen. There is so much redundancy. Those columns are every meter. You had a vertical column on the perimeter there, and if you take out some, they said you could take out all of the columns low in the building I think it was for I'm not sure, I can't quote exactly, but it was like more than half of the columns, and it would still sustain. It would still support itself against hurricane winds and everything else. It was very, very solidly built. So it's not a fragile thing at all. These, if you've ever been down there, I never went to New York, but I know what 64 meters looks like. 64 meters square. It's like literally an acre of floor space for each floor there. That is a humongous building. And the core columns were absolutely massive. They have video showing the construction of the towers and guys standing next to some of these columns. A person would be dwarfed by these things. This is a massive structure.
Right. And these planes are like flying cigar tubes. They're just, light aluminum. When you look at the video of Building 7 collapsing, are you able to determine where, if it was brought down by controlled demolition, where those charges would have been placed, like on what floor?
Well, it had to be, okay, when you see Building 7 in the video footage that's out there, all you're basically seeing is like the top half of the building because of all the foreground structures.
Right.
And they figure that the sections that were taken out were pretty low in the building, so below the level where you could actually see it. So what you're seeing over the tops of all the foreground looks like undamaged, virtually undamaged structure up until the time you have global collapse. There was the east penthouse collapsed into the building, and that there's good reason to believe that was a fairly localized collapse in the top floors. There are only a few floors up there where there was window damage underneath that collapse. And then the rest of the structures on the roof collapsed in about a half a second before the whole building let go and collapsed. And so that the interior sort of let go, and then boom, the whole entire building came down. In fact, you can see the remnants of the west penthouse is still visible throughout the entire freefall part of the collapse. So it never had NIST says, well, they collapsed first. Well, no, they didn't. I want to address that, by the way. Do I have a second to follow up on this?
Yeah, you've got a couple minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things NIST says was the whole center of the building, it gutted itself somehow, and then all you're seeing is just this exterior tube, so to speak. No way. And here's why. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why. But when the east penthouse fell into the building, you can see that as it collapses into the building, there's a bunch of window breakage underneath. So in other words, what's going on inside the building makes itself visible on the outside. There was no more window breakage anywhere in the building until the general collapse at the end. And then all sorts of windows started breaking simultaneously as the building started to come down. Furthermore, when the building came down, there was this huge roiling debris cloud. They compare it to like pyroclastic flow practically from a volcano eruption. You can see this just moving down the street. If the interior of the building had collapsed prior to the visible shell of the building, all of that debris cloud would have been flowing down the street earlier. But you don't see that until the visible collapse. And so both the appearance of the exterior and that debris cloud, you can tell that the collapse you're seeing is the real collapse. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that's something, if you read about this stuff, you'll hear somebody claiming that.
All right. David Chandler, scientist for 9/11 Truth and 9/11speakout.org. And where do we see that 6-part series on freefall?
Oh, it's on medium.com, but you can get the link to my article just by going to 9/11speakout.org. There's a link very close to the top of the website there.
Fantastic. Yeah. David, thank you for your time. I learned a lot. All right, David Chandler. For George Norrie, George Knapp, Lisa Lyons, Stephanie Smith, Tom Danheiser, Dan Galante, Gina Salvati, Michael Cozio, Chris Burrows, and Ryan Stacy, I'm Richard Serrett. Thank you for your ears and your voices, your beautiful voices. Until next time, so long for now.